November 1963, I've got the best job any sixth grader can have in elementary school. I am running down the hallway to my cafeteria job, which gets me out of class a half an hour early for lunchtime. And every day as I entered the cafeteria, which was in a multi-purpose hall in our elementary school, I would always hear a radio playing music for our cooks that prepared the noontime meal for the boys and girls. Well, this day I burst through the doors, and for the first time ever, I don't hear music. I hear the drone of a news radio station in the background, a voice I can't make out. And just as I get to the door to enter the kitchen, I hear this sobbing. And I walk in, and these two very tough, older women who had very little sense of humor about them, they were very, very stern, were the cooks. They're in each other's arms and they're sobbing. And they looked at me and they said, "They've just killed our president." It's a moment in time for an 11-year-old, for any American of my era, that you'll never forget. You can recall each detail of the moment, each tear that was shed, each hour that passed over the weekend watching this very, very powerful ceremony play out in front of you. All the television channels were given over to the coverage of the body returning to Washington and then being set in state, and then the funeral entourage as it moves towards Arlington. You remember each stage of that, because not just that an 11-year-old would remember something special, but an entire nation remembers that as a tipping point in our innocence. It all changed after that. The interesting thing, to be an elementary school age child at that time, John Kennedy was the same age as our father. He'd been a junior officer in World War II. My goodness, can you recall the last time a first lady was actually expecting a child while she was in the White House? This was all so fresh, all so young. He talked about the torch being passed to a new generation of leaders. He talked about the spirit of engagement of what we could do that would change the world. Not what government would do, but what we could do as individuals to change the world. And that filters down through all the age brackets, and it rests in the children of men and women that are talking about this. And so it was a very vibrant time. He was young, he was alive. So much we didn't know of his health, so much we didn't know of his behavior and his associations behind the scenes. But what we saw was very compelling. It was very young, it was very possible, and that's what we remember. It's interesting for a child that was just 11 years old to think about the end of an innocence. But if we look at it over the lens of 50 years, the Kennedy assassination ends an era and it begins an era. The era it begins, quite movingly and sadly, is the fact that it gives birth to a 24/7 news cycle for the first time in broadcast television. Cameras are there taking us into these events as they play out. Now, it's commonplace today, but it really was born back in those terrible days of November 1963. What it ends, however, is an innocent period in the role of the media, where the media would turn away from personal stories, would allow privacy to elected officials. Let's put it this way. The media tended to say, that's a person's private life, it's not their public performance. And what we find is that's the last stand in the Kennedy era, where the adoring, worshipful media that did so many positive profiles about his private life and his youthful countenance and his family, those would become fewer and far between in the years after John F. Kennedy.